Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Defense Against the Dark Arts course, Session 3 from Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I am your teacher today, K.L. Zeldin, and it is great to be here. But I realize as I'm doing this right now, I forgot to turn my light on. So hold on 1 second, everybody. 1 second. All right, there we are. That's a little bit better, I suppose. There's only so much you can do with what you're working with. So at any rate, welcome back to the Heart of Darkness. This is our Session 3. We actually read the entirety of Chapter 2 today, and I am really excited for today. I had some homemade red beans and rice with probably 1 extra dash of Tabasco that I didn't need, but I wanted it, and here we go. Ready to go. So I'm going to just dive right into our session today. I didn't do any music or anything like that, but one of the things that I think it is important for you to always remember when you are sort of picking something back up again, for instance, you're going to finish tonight's class and then you're going to spend the week or so before you read the next assignment. I always think it's a good idea to look at the the previous couple of paragraphs from the prior reading, just to kind of get a sense. But I call it a kind of like to pick up the tail, that sort of thing. So I think it's probably a good idea to do that. So let me just share my screen and get my not so fancy PowerPoint presentation queued up. There we go. And all right, so go here. Welcome back. Of course, it's not Session 2, it's Session 3, poor production values. But here we are, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Defense Against the Dark Arts. Okay, so that portrait right there is sort of an artistic rendition. People surmise might be, the real Mr. Kurtz. But there's Mr. Kurtz, and you can sort of see the reflection sort of slowly coming into focus. And that really is the drama of this second part. But just as a reminder, what are we doing here? I want you to get better at reading. I want you to feel more confident that you can actually do this, that you're sort of building out your powers. I want to show you the ropes, as I said last time. And I want to remind you always that I want you to see the story by studying story, to give you an insight into story. And I think this chapter in particular is a kind of master class in taxing us, taxing the audience to really pay attention. What do you see? What do we hear? These are always the questions. And we have a tendency, I think, if I am indicative of this in any way, and certainly my students would agree that this is sort of what they struggle with. We tend to read for information. We read for, what do I need to know? It's sort of a very utilitarian sense of what reading is for. And that's always true. You always have to pay attention to the details. And when I am teaching this in a class, in a classroom setting, I don't have the opportunity to give you a quiz, but I always give a quiz. And what I'm doing with that quiz is I'm holding my students accountable, but by the who, what, where, when, and the non-interpretive why. I'm really trying to get my students to recognize that you first have to you first have to attend to these kinds of details. So like what happened? And that's what we're going to do a little bit today. But beyond that, right, part of the reason why I think that The Heart of Darkness is such a masterpiece is that it traffics in the very thing that Marlowe is frustrated from last reading. He turns to his audience. Remember, he's on this cruise ship, the Nell, and he turns to his audience. Do you hear it? Do you see it? And he's like, you can't. We live like we dream alone, right? Because he is not capable of conveying the feeling, the dream sensation of the dream. Because as we all know, as soon as you start telling someone your dream, you sound kind of crazy, maybe even a little creepy. But Marlowe is going to persist nonetheless. My argument, right, is that Conrad is very Conrad is very aware of this dynamic in storytelling. So what he is doing, especially here with chapter 2, is he is trying to give us the feeling of what it was like to sort of grope in the darkness as he's hurtling toward the inner station. And he has this sneaking suspicion that he is hurtling toward this inner station to meet his destiny. Mr. Kurtz as a kind of figure he has been predetermined somehow to meet. And so notice here that we don't see him right away. We hear about him, and then we see him in sort of these fleeting images. And this is Marlowe recreating for us the sensation, the feeling, the vibe, as everybody talks about, it seems, these days. It's one of those words that's kind of bubbled up onto the consciousness level for everybody. And so this book is really about the establishment, I think, of a vibe, but it is a vibe that carries with it thought and feeling at the same time. So I want you to turn to the last paragraph of chapter 1. I know it's last week's reading, but I want you to turn to the last paragraph of chapter 1. And if we recall, he gets to the station, the central, not the interstation, but the central station, the headquarters, and he finds his boat in a bad state. It is sunk in the river, and he has gotten it out, but he's waiting for rivets, and he keeps waiting for rivets, and it's rivets, and it's rivets, and no rivets came, right? So here he is, he's sort of waiting for this, and he says, I had given up. This is the very last paragraph of chapter 1, and I'm just reading from it. So I had given up worrying myself about the rivets. One's capacity for that kind of folly is more limited than you would suppose. I said, hang and let things slide. I had plenty of time for meditation, and now and then I would give some thought to Kurtz. I wasn't very interested in him. No, still, I was curious to see whether this man, who had come out equipped with moral ideas of some sort, would climb to the top after all, and how he would set about his work when there. This notion of work and moral ideas of some sort. Well, we're going to get a sort of image of that in tonight's reading, but that is what is intriguing. And so remember, for Marlowe at this point, his only concern is that he wants to get his boat out of the river, he wants to repair the boat, and he wants to begin his commission, which is to go in, take the steamer up the river, to treacherous river, and retrieve Mr. Kurtz and whatever ivory is there for them to take out. Remember, I talked about ivory as this raw material that is being sourced and taken, extracted from the continent of Africa and up into the European markets. And so that's the work. But remember, we know that there's the work as in commerce, but there's also the work with a capital W, this work, a worker of light. And Marlowe is, at this point, kind of bemused. I think that's a good way to say it. He's kind of bemused by this idea that, there's this sort of, people are sort of, the do-gooders are over there sort of doing good, but I'm just here to do my job. That's kind of his outlook. And he knows that he does not like any of these people. He can see right away that, that the manager is not a good guy. His nephew is not a good guy. He senses that there's some kind of conspiracy against Kurtz. And so the only reason that he is at this stage amenable to Kurtz and sort of sees him as maybe a potential ally is because he knows that these guys do not like Kurtz at all. All right. And so here in the opening of chapter 2, we see that Marlowe has taken the boat out of the river and it's sort of on its side and he's sort of doing repairs and he's sort of using the boat like his house. And if you recall, there was the conversation earlier about sailors are not really adventurers. They're homebodies, and their home just happens to be a ship that goes around the world, say, or up a river. So Marlowe, true to his sort of sailor roots, is staying very close. In fact, he's sleeping on the deck of the ship in such a way it looks like it's cantered over in some way. So he's sitting on the deck, but the two guys below him can't see him. And so these two guys when they're talking. He says, this is the very start of chapter 2. One evening, as I was lying flat on the deck of my steamboat, I heard voices approaching, and there were the nephew and the uncle strolling along the bank. I laid my head on my arm again and had nearly lost myself in a doze when somebody said in my ear, as it were, I'm as harmless as a little child, but I don't like to be dictated to. Am I the manager or am I not? I was ordered to send him there. It's incredible. I became aware that the two were standing on the shore alongside the forepart of the steamboat just below my head. I did not move, and it did not move. It did not occur to me to move. I was sleepy. It is unpleasant, grunted the uncle. He has asked the administration to be sent there, said the other, with the idea of showing what he could do, and I was instructed accordingly. Look at the influence that man must have. Is it not frightful? Influence, right? So we're going to sort of think about what kind of influence or leverage does this Kurtz guy have. Now, of course, remember, at this stage of the game, if we're looking at the real time of the unfolding of the story, it's very important to recognize that he doesn't even know what Kurtz looks like. He's never heard his voice. He doesn't even know anything about him. But there's this image sort of building of Kurtz in his, almost like his potential, if that makes sense. Okay. So, all right. And he's extremely jealous of the influence that this Kurtz, this Johnny-come-lately, this Kurtz has over the administration. And again, notice that we don't even really know what this administration is about. It's something about the business, etc. They both agreed that it was frightful. Then made several bizarre remarks. Make rain and fine weather, one man. The council by the nose. Bits of absurd sentences. And so if you look at these, they're all sort of ways in which they're showing that he's almost achieved godlike status, that he can almost make the rain happen. This is how powerful it is. And of course, they're extremely jealous. They want the power. After all, they've been out here all these years surviving the malaria and all the various things, right? So we continue. I had pretty near the whole of my wits about me when the uncle said, the climate may do away with this difficulty for you. Is he alone there? Yes, answered the manager. He sent his assistant down the river with a note to me in these terms. These are now Kurtz's words. And look at this. These are the first words that we get from Kurtz. And I mentioned this briefly, and one of you sent me a great message on Twitter just the other day, to kind of give you some tools, right, to think this through. And one of the tools that I want you to be conscious of is that anytime a character is introduced, you should pay attention. A good storyteller knows that there's only one chance to make a first physical impression. But savvy storytellers will prepare you for that eventual arrival of the main character or of the primary antagonist or the protagonist or what have you, by using the power of rumor and using the power of a reputation that somehow might precede you. So always pay attention to those kinds of things. And so these are the first words that we get from Mr. Kurtz. Clear this, and this is the note, right, that he's giving to the manager. And he's like, clear this poor devil out of the country and don't bother sending more of that sort. I had rather be alone than have the kind of men you can dispose of with me. And that was a year ago, right? So right away we get the sense that Kurtz does not suffer fools, or at least in his conception of what a fool might be. It's somewhat ironic that I said that because we're going to meet the Harlequin later on in this chapter. But he does not suffer people that are not down with the Kurtz program very lightly. And of course, the impudence, right? These two guys they're disgusted. It was more than a year ago. Can you imagine such impudence? Anything since then? Asked the other hoarsely. Ivory, jerked out the nephew. Lots of it. Prime sort, lots, most annoying from him. And with that, questioned the heavy rumble, invoice was the reply fired out, so to speak. Then silence. They had been talking about Kurtz. I was broad awake by this time, but lying perfectly at ease. This is Marlowe, of course, telling us this. Remaining perfectly still, having no inducement to change my position. How did that ivory come all this way? Growled the elder man, who seemed very vexed. The other explained that it had come with a fleet of canoes, in charge of an English half-caste clerk Kurtz had with him. That Kurtz had apparently intended to return himself, the station being by that time bare of goods and stores, but after coming 300 miles had suddenly decided to go back, which he started to do alone in a small dugout with 4 paddlers, leaving the half-caste to continue down the river with the ivory. The 2 fellows there seemed astounded at anybody attempting such a thing. They were at a loss for an adequate motive. As to me, I seemed to see Kurtz for the first time. So notice we hear the words and then an image of Kurtz in the dugout. This is the first time that Marlowe says he sees Kurtz for the first time. And so therefore, notice that this is the first time that we see Kurtz for the first time. And the image that Marlowe, the storyteller, is implanting in his audience, therefore, which gets implanted in us, the audience, is this image of a white man standing in a dugout canoe with 4 paddlers, natives, going back into the heart of the jungle. And these guys are like, this is crazy, totally crazy. He says, I'm going to finish this off. As to me, I seemed to see Kurtz for the first time. It was a distinct glimpse. The dugout, 4 paddling savages, and the lone white man turning his back suddenly on the headquarters, on relief, on thoughts of home, right? Because any other white guy, from Europe going to the heart of the Congo in the 1890s would be dying to get out of this place, right? To get back to civilization, to relief, to thoughts of home, perhaps, setting his face toward the depths of the wilderness, towards his empty and desolate station. Because he doesn't have anything left in the station. The whole point of coming back to the central station is to get supplies so that you can go back into the inner station. But Kurtz is like, yeah, I don't need that. And these 2 guys are like, what is this? This is crazy. I did not know the motive. Perhaps he was just simply a fine fellow who stuck to his work for its own sake. His name, you understand, had not been pronounced once. He was that man, the half-caste who, as far as I could see, had conducted a difficult trip with great prudence and pluck, was invariably alluded to as that scoundrel. The scoundrel had reported that the man had been very ill, had recovered imperfectly. The 2 below me moved away then a few paces and strolled back and forth at some little distance. I heard military post, doctor, 200 miles, quite alone now, unavoidable delays, 9 months, no news, strange rumors. So we see these strange rumors. We might ask, what are these strange rumors? Right? Now, later on, we're going to see that these strange rumors are some kind of religious rite. It's very strange. So I'm going to go to that. But I'm going to pull out of this channel here just for a second. And I want to show you that there's a kind of a basic structure that is emerging. And we might want to call this sort of the main frame, the main structure of the story, right? And it starts, of course, with Marlowe back in London, back from a trip around the world, and he is kind of getting antsy, and he has this idea. He sees a map again. He says, you know what? I've done all this saltwater thing. I'm going to do freshwater. And so then he goes and he gets his commission, and he has that strange encounter in Belgium. He comes back and he says goodbye to his aunt, and then he goes on down through the coast of Africa, and he finally gets to the outer station. And chapter 2 is, and so he gets there, and of course he has to wait. And we have to wait. We talked last class about the poetics of delay, and that is a sort of a classic storytelling motif. It's like, wait for more details. Wait, right? We're amping up so as to experience it ideally. Maybe that's a good way there. So anyway, so he gets his commission in chapter 1, and now in chapter 2 he will finally fix the steamer, and he's going to now go in upstream it's a steamboat upstream to the inner station. So that is where they're headed. And all of chapter 2, in terms of the A-frame of the story, all of chapter 2 takes place right and up until the very point in which they get to the inner station and they meet that multicolored guy called the Harlequin. So chapter 3, as you can tell, will be his discovery of Kurtz himself. Okay, so that's the A-frame. We've got, the commission, the journey, and the discovery. But what I want you to pay attention to is the way in which we've got the Marlowe in the story, and we've got Marlowe the narrator. And Marlowe the narrator is kind of jumping in and out of the story, in and out of chronological time, offering us either a kind of commentary or a gloss on what just happened, or he will take something that he has already learned from that later part and inserting it now. And so that's one of the reasons why this short little compact 95 pages can be a little bit confusing, because it's not always clear. You really have to pay attention. It's not always, where are we? Who is he talking about? What is he talking about? And I will say, this is almost impossible to read just one time. There, see, I just hooked you in. I did a classic teacher bait and switch. No, but I'm serious. It's a great book to read the first time, but it is a magnificent book to read a second time, right? Because now you, like Marlowe, has the benefit of the experience of the story, right? And not only does it give you that benefit, now you can start to see the design and you can make sense out of those things. Yeah, I think that's right, Stephanie. The suspense that is being built up is aided in an interesting way by getting a kind of pre-interpretation of the importance of some of these events. And so, yeah, so anyway, what I do when I'm reading this, especially chapter 2, anytime that something happens outside of the chronological flow of the story, I mark and I write aside, a sort of that kind of thing, just so I am paying attention to what is going on. Okay, so next slide. Okay, all right. And so this is just the quick, 6 bullet points of what happens, right? Because one of the things that, you really have to first read for is what happens. Excuse me one second. Sorry, a little dry mouth there. Okay. So, so the overheard conversation is the first part, and then the journey up the river begins. Somewhere in the middle of the journey, they come to this hut, and they see stacked firewood with a note, and it says, "Approach cautiously." Then they go upstream further, and they get stuck in the fog, and then they hear this cry in the fog, and then they have this attack in this white fog. And then we have this rather lengthy, almost 10-page, 8 to 10-page aside about Kurtz, his words spoken and his words written. And then at the very end, we meet this Harlequin guy. He's this guy that Kurtz kind of has this hanger-on guy who's sort of helping him and is really clearly enamored with Kurtz. And he will tell Marlowe and the manager and the rest of the so-called pilgrims that they don't want him to go. That's a little weird. Because if you any other situation, you have a European agent who is in charge of stealing, essentially, finding ways to extract as much ivory from the natives and from the landscape, from nature itself, and getting it out as quickly as possible. And so those relations between the agents and the natives was probably not a good one, let's say. And this the historical record is very clear on this. It's really horrifying and gruesome and all that. So, but they don't want him to go. So this is already a complete inversion. So that's one of those things that's just important for us to be mindful of. Why would a native of the Congo River Valley want this white guy to stick around. What is it about this guy? We already know that the other white guys cannot stand him. The other agents and pilgrims and these guys who've gone to Africa to make their fortune, they think that he's ridiculous, full of himself. Yet the natives, on the other hand, worship him, like he's some sort of vision, some sort of deity. And so that's weird. And Marlowe has no idea what to make of this. And so he basically doesn't say much about it. He's like, well, that's weird. I'm just steering my boat. So let's talk a little bit about the river journey. After he finally sees him. Remember, the manager has said that he is recovered imperfectly. And there are strange rumors. And so that's an important thing for us to remember. Strange rumors. Now, the journey starts in earnest on page 41, which is 3 or 4 pages into chapter 2. But there's one more gloss right after that section I read on the strange rumors. This conversation continues. He says, "We will not be free from unfair competition till one of these fellows is hanged for an example," he said. "Certainly," grunted the other. "Get him hanged. Why not? Anything can be done in this country. That's what I say. Nobody here, you understand, here can endanger your position. And why? You stand the climate. You outlast them all. The danger is in Europe. In other words, the danger is in the administration. They can't touch us here. The best thing you can do is to stay alive. And hey, you're good at that. You outlast them all. The danger's in Europe. But there, before I left, I took care to..." They moved off and whispered, and their voices rose again. Notice that Marlowe can't quite get the whole story. So we too can't quite get the whole story. And so we're getting little details. And so we're trying to string these fact patterns together in some kind of sensible narrative, but we can't quite grasp it yet. But we're getting an impression. They moved off and whispered. Then their voices rose again. "The extraordinary series of delays is not my fault. I did my possible." The fat man sighed. "Very sad. And the pestiferous absurdity of his talk," continued the other. "He bothered me enough when he was here." These are his words. This is Kurtz. He's talking about his talk. And this is him, the manager, mocking Kurtz with his own words. He says, "Each station should be like a beacon on the road toward better things. A center for trade, of course, but also for humanizing, improving, and instructing. Conceive you, that ass. And he wants to be manager? No, it's..." And he goes off. Now, what is this business? Each station should be like a beacon on the road toward better things. Humanizing, improving, and instructing. Yeah, sure, of course, trade. But there's these other things, these value added. And Conrad, Marlowe can see so clearly that there's a disconnect between what they are actually there to do, which is to establish some sort of trading situation. And however free or unfree that is pretty obviously not, but fine, trade. But then there's this other stuff. And the manager seems to understand sort of the brute realities of trade. He's a businessman of some sort. But what he doesn't understand is this business of enlightenment. Now, it's important, of course, to recognize that Kurtz is, well, we'll see that. He's not, Kurtz is not a missionary in the sort of classic sense that we would say a sort of a Christian missionary. He's not that. He's some new thing, which for me has deep resonances with the kinds of things that we see now. And these humanist agendas, which one is the most important thing? But we already know that Kurtz, in other words, is a believer, right? Not so much in sort of the old-fashioned gospel. He's a believer in European and Enlightenment values. Remember, he wants to humanize, improve, and instruct, right? That's what he wants to do. It's a kind of gospel of European liberalism, maybe. And so he notes, Marlowe says to us on page 41, just as he's about to embark on this journey, I was rather than excited at the prospect of meeting Kurtz very soon. When I say very soon, I mean it comparatively. It was just 2 months from the day we left the creek when we came back to the bank below Kurtz's station. Okay, so wild. So that from this point to the end of chapter 2 is 2 months. 2 months' time. And it is not a trip up or around a lazy river. It is a harrowing journey, in part because he's never made it before. But the river, the Congo River, is filled with dangers just below the surface. The kind of dangers are fallen trees that create stumps in the water so that you could sort of run. So you have to constantly be on the look for sort of changes on the surface of the river. Do you see the trails? Do you see the things that are just below the surface? Because that could ruin the whole trip, to say the least, right? You'll ruin the ship, right? So this is a very harrowing journey. And so if you can find me, I'm going to start from the paragraph that reads at the beginning, going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world. So I want you to notice that the trip up the river is not just told to us, but there's some kind of an attempt on Marlowe's part to recreate the experience. So this is what he says. Going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. The air was warm, thick, heavy, sluggish. There was no joy in the brilliance of sunshine. The long stretches of the waterway ran on, deserted into the gloom of overshadowed distances. On silvery sandbanks, hippos and alligators sunned themselves side by side. 2 very dangerous creatures, as you know. The broadening waters flowed through a mob of wooded islands. You lost your way on that river as you would in a desert, and butted all day long against shoals, trying to find the channel, till you thought yourself bewitched and cut off forever from everything you had known once, somewhere, far away, in another existence perhaps. Notice he keeps insisting this idea of being cut off from what you know, that is this disorienting experience. And so stories, then, we can, I think, extract this notion that stories are a kind of disorientation machine, that they take us out of our familiars, right? And they stick us in radically, in this case, unfamiliars, and recreate this experience. So what do you do when you're lost? Well, you try to find your way. And so Marlowe has to sort of find his orientation point, but you were cut off. There were moments when one's past came back to one, as it will sometimes when you have not a moment to spare to yourself, but it came in the shape of an unrestful and noisy dream, remembered with wonder amongst the overwhelming realities of this strange world of plants and water and silence. And this stillness of life did not in the least resemble a peace. It was the stillness of an implacable force brooding over an inscrutable intention. It looked at you with a vengeful aspect. So this is not a peaceful dream. This is not a peaceful journey. This is not a restful pilgrimage. It's one that can only be characterized by a kind of confounding unease, dis-ease, perhaps even. It's a dis-easing experience. Marlowe thrown out of his comfort zone. So he's constantly scanning several things, right? He's worried about, yes, Stephanie, that's exactly right. Right, that's exactly right, Cass. You know that he's trying to render intelligible the feeling to recreate, to give to us. Right, so this is just a remarkable. So you have to remember. So he's the captain of the ship. So he's in charge, right? And he has to scan the horizon. He has to scan the banks on the right and the left. He has to scan if there's shoals that he's going to have to navigate and find, right? He has to scan and see if there's stumps that are laying just below the surface, a stump that could render him helpless for months on end. You know, so this is extremely harrowing experience. He goes on, he says, this is, again, Penguin, top page 42. Sorry if you don't have that, but I'm just continuing from where I was just reading. I had to keep a lookout for the signs of dead wood we could cut up in the night for the next day's steaming. When you have to attend to things of that sort, look at that word. That word attend, to attend to something, right, is to pay attention to something. When you have to attend to things of that sort, to the mere incidents of the surface, the reality, I tell you, fades. Right? So the wholeness of it fades, and you're focused on, I need to find that, and I need to find this. Right? I need to make sure this is working. I need to make sure that that guy gets the steamer, between, in that sweet spot so that it doesn't explode. Right? So many things. He can't think of the whole of reality. He has to be micro-focused on these details. The inner truth is hidden, he says. The inner truth, God, love it. The inner truth is hidden, luckily. So that's counterintuitive. Why is it good that the inner truth is hidden? Well, because maybe the inner truth is too much to face. But I felt it all the same. I felt often its mysterious stillness watching me at my monkey tricks, just as it watches you fellows performing on your respective tightropes for, what is it, half a crown a tumble? And so in this moment, he's making fun of the sailors that are listening to him on the boat. And he's like, oh, come on, Marlon, be nice about it. So because he basically just calls them, and he says, look, I'm a monkey too. Right. So you have that kind of image of sort of being that hired monkey doing his thing. And he says, I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry. I forgot the heartache, which makes up the rest of the price. Anyway, and he says, exactly, Corey. He says, I managed not to sink this steamboat, right? So notice that he jumps out of the story for a second. He jumps out of the chronology and says, yeah, so I didn't wreck the ship, just so we're all clear. I didn't wreck the ship. But he does say, you never forget the thump of the log, the submerged log against the hull of your little tin steamboat. You never forget that thump. All right. Okay. Then he goes on, he says, so that's the river. You have to constantly scan the above the surface and the below the surface, and then the drums. And so the vision, and now we go to the hearing. So he's hearing these drums all the time. He says this river, this crawling river, brings him inexorably to Kurtz. He says right in the middle of page 43, we penetrated deeper and deeper into the heart of darkness. It was very quiet there. At night, sometimes the roll of drums behind the curtain of trees would run up the river and remain sustained faintly, as if hovering in the air over our heads till the first break of day. Whether these drums, this meant war, peace, or prayer, we could not tell. The dawns were heralded by the descent of a chill stillness. The woodcutters slept, their fires burned low. The snapping of a twig would make you start. We were wanderers on a prehistoric Earth, and on Earth that wore the aspect of an unknown planet. We could have fancied ourselves the first men taking possession of an accursed inheritance, i.e. Adam and Eve. Notice the way he's doing this with time, right? The first men taking possession of an accursed inheritance to be subdued at the cost of profound anguish and of excessive toil. It's like, why is he doing this? Why is he telling this story this way? I think he's again, recreating this. What would it have felt like? And we've already known from the beginning, as he's sitting there on the banks of the Thames, he's always playing this game, this time game, right? We're here in the present, and we're talking about the English explorers, and he's like, yeah, this too was once a place of darkness where the barbarian roamed. And so he's sort of playing with these notions of time and telescoping backwards and forwards. But you can see that this journey is more than just the journey, right? That the literal level, we might say, is this sort of thin veneer over which is stretched. It's this stretched thin veneer over which is this impenetrable heart of darkness. And so, like, what is that? And so, I just have to say, as a side note, the great popular reading of this book right now is that this is a meditation on colonialism, and of course it is, right? But to me, to limit the book to a mere gloss on sort of the evils of historic Western imperialism really misses the point. Yes, that's bad. That's clear. Full stop. Don't even need to qualify that one. But really, what's going on is that he will, I think, predict what Solzhenitsyn will say later on, of course, in the 20th century, about 50 or so years later, when he says that the line of evil cuts right through the human heart, right? That we all have this, right? It's not just this simple white hats and black hats type situation. It's much more troubling, frankly, than that. And so I just think we need to remember that he's doing more than this. Again, skip 5 lines from that excessive toil line. The steamer toiled along slowly on the edge of a black and incomprehensible frenzy. The prehistoric man was cursing us, praying to us, welcoming us. Who could tell? We were cut off from the comprehension of our surroundings. So what does it mean to be cut off from the comprehension of your own surroundings? That is why this is so problem. Then he goes on to this beautiful meditation on page 44. And he's like, look, it's not that I could just sort of say, oh, what a bunch of savages. It's quite the contrary. As you could see very clearly that they were the same, right? They were the same. He said, what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity. He's talking now about the natives. What thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. He goes on to say, and why not? The mind of man is capable of anything because everything is in it, all the past as well as all the future. I'd love to hear someone like Peterson riff on this, but the idea that the present contains with it all that has come before it, right? And all that will come from this moment. It's just this brilliance, this notion of this fecund present, right? That sits on top of this thing or between these two things. He says, what was there after all? Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage, who can tell? But truth stripped of its cloak of time. Let the fool gape and shudder. The man knows and can look on without a wink, but he must at least be as much of a man as these on the shore. He must meet that truth with his own true stop, with his own inborn strength. Principles won't do. Acquisitions, clothes, pretty rags that would fly off the first good shake. No. You want a deliberate belief. An appeal to me in this fiendish row is there. Very well, I admit, but I have a voice too. And for good and evil, mine is the speech that cannot be silenced. Of course, a fool, what with sheer fright and fine sentiments, is always safe. Right? And so he's really admonishing us, the audience. It's like, look, you could talk about principle, but do you know what it's like to sort of face these dark things, really? And that'll be something he will meditate on later on. I think it's very, very important. There was surface truth enough in these things to save a wiser man. The surface truth of things. And really what makes Marlowe different from all these other cats is that he is not content with surface reality. He knows that lurking beneath the surface, underneath, if you will, is where the important stuff resides. And though you might want to spend your time attending to this surface reality, don't pretend that there's not something deeper and more important there. All right, so they hit the hut. And at the hut, they come across the wood, they come across the note, and I believe the note says, approach cautiously. Approach cautiously. But he also finds a book. And it is a book, it's a sailing book, a sailor's manual, and it's in English, and it's like knots and, all those kinds of things. But he notices that in the margins, I love this, sort of this meta moment, but that in the margins, he sees scribbled this. He says, very bottom of page 46, but still more astounding. Sorry, he says, such a book being there was wonderful enough. Again, you just have to remember, this is Africa. This is not Africa of 2024. This is the Africa of the late 1880s, and very raw, untamed landscape. And so to see a hut is interesting. To see cut firewood is interesting, but to see a book, even more crazy, right? Such a book being there was wonderful enough, but still more astounding were the notes penciled in the margin and plainly referring to the text. I couldn't believe my eyes. They were in cipher. Yes, it looked like cipher. Fancy a man lugging with him a book on that description into this nowhere and studying it and making notes in cipher at that. It was an extravagant mystery. Now, of course, we all know the word decipher. Cipher is the word for code. Right? Now, later on, we will find that this is probably just Cyrillic. Right? This is the Russians' book that we will meet later on. But it's in code. But notice the way that Marlowe is experiencing this. I can't decipher what is written. Just like I can't see what is below the surface. I can't quite make sense out of this. I'm hearing these bits and pieces of stories, and I'm hearing about Kurtz, but I can't quite see him yet. I can't quite decipher it yet. There's a mystery that needs to be unlocked. And I'm thinking here of that opening section that it's not just the truth that's inside the nut, but it's the whole experience. So what is it like to go through this extended period of time, this extended harrowing journey in which you have to live, as Stephanie says, moment to moment? Right? What is that like? What does that do to a person? But you want to know. You want to be able to decipher. And so for us, we, the audience who are reading this now, are in this exact same position of trying to make sense out of this. And so again, I want to, I feel like a little bit of a broken record here, but I want you to see that oftentimes stories become about how to read stories. And so, well, that sounds a little bit, taught like a tautology or but no, but there's something about this, in the context of, doing this course on defense against the dark arts. Like part of it is sort of how to be a better reader of a situation. And what are you reading? Well, here we're reading words, but we're translating those words into images, and we're seeing the narrative unfold. And there is a virtue in that very process, right? I could simply, just like I have here, with these bullet points, I could just sort of do the whole book like that. And it might be, 150 beats. They call that with a script, right? So we could do that, but it's not the same thing as the experience of the thing itself. And so confession, I must admit that there are times where I listen to podcasts at speed and a half, usually speed 1.25, but anyway, let's call it speed and a half. One ought not to listen to or read a story at time and a half speed, right? Because the experience has to unfold in time. Just like Marlowe can't apparate from the central station to the inner station, that there's something meaningful about making his way up the river. And remember, that current can be strong. The trip back is a lot easier. Because remember, the flow of the river going this way, all of the debris points this way. But when the flow of the river is going this way and things fall this way, that's where you have those wood pieces of timber that are up this way. So going this way, smooth sailing. It's the going up the river that's the point. And so, again, that as an image unto itself, to go up river. this very difficult journey. And sure, it would be great to just kind of skip this whole part and go up, but Marlowe is making his audience feel what it is like to take 2 months to go up this way. Even then, I have to say, he does compress the story pretty well. But I think this is really just very important. After he sees these notes and he pockets the book and he starts going again, and of course the manager doesn't like this guy because the manager thinks that this is a guy who's poaching without a license. Basically, that's kind of his thing. Marlowe will say this line. He says, "One gets sometimes a flash of insight. The essentials of this affair lay deep under the surface, beyond my reach and beyond my power of meddling." It's kind of a moment of humility. He's like, yeah, I'm thinking about all this stuff, but there's not really much I can do about it. Right? And I can't grasp it. I can't quite attend to it. And so they come into this, they anchor for the night, and it's dark and it's still, and he's sort of meditating on the dark and the stillness of it all. And then they wake up to this white fog. And in the middle of this white fog, a fog that's not lifting, they hear this muffled rattle, a cry, a very loud cry on page 48, as of infinite desolation, soared slowly in the opaque air. Skip a few lines. Sorry, keep going. Keep going, it's too good. It ceased. A complaining clamor, modulated in savage discords, filled our ears. The sheer unexpectedness of the cry made my hair stir under my cap. I don't know how it struck the others. To me, it seemed as though the mist itself had screamed so suddenly, and apparently from all sides at once did this tumultuous and mournful uproar arise. It culminated in a hurried outbreak of almost intolerably excessive shrieking. Good God, what is the meaning? Good God, what is the meaning? So you have to place yourself in here. You know, you're getting deeper and deeper and deeper upriver on this boat that is missing death seemingly every 15 to 20 minutes. You wake up in this white, dense fog and you can't see, right? The truth of things, the truth of the landscape, you can't see. It used to be nighttime and now it's daytime and now you can't see. So there's this interesting inversion. You can't see. And you say, good God, what is the meaning? Later on, he'll say, the rest of the world was nowhere. And they're wondering to themselves, they know these are voices of men. Will they attack? Will they attack? I love this little bit about the cannibals that they've hired as crewmen. I don't really have time to get into it too much, but there's a sort of wry irony there that the crew are cannibals, but they're well-behaved cannibals, right? They've brought their own rotting hippo meat on board, and But at any rate, we recognize that they're relying on the restraint of these powers that are surrounding them. At least that's how Marlowe feels. He says, restraint? What possible restraint on page 51? Was it superstition, disgust, patience, fear of some kind of primitive honor? No fear can stand up to hunger. No patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is. And as to superstition, beliefs, and what you may call principles, they are less than chaff. They are less than chaff in a breeze. Don't you know the devilry of lingering starvation, its exasperating torment, its black thoughts, its somber and brooding ferocity? Well, I do. It takes a man all his inborn strength to fight hunger properly. and the desperate grief of these cries. And so notice he's twinning the cry, the clamor, with hunger. Something about sort of that preternatural, overpowering sense of desire. He goes on, he talks a little bit about this on page 52. And you can't escape, right? Because they're in sort of this treacherous position. And if they go full blast forward or full blast backwards, they have no idea what they're going to run into. So they have to just kind of wait and absorb the attack. He says, the cry had given him an irresistible impression of sorrow, of unrestrained grief. Now, later on, we recognize, and we've already talked about this, right, that really the grief of that cry is that the natives know that these guys are coming to take away Kurtz. And so they're not so much as attacking the ship as much as they are defending, trying to repulse these forces that have come to take them. And the attack happens on page 54 and 55. The Pilgrims, of course, open fire and hit nothing because they're firing from the hip as opposed to, actually aiming at something. Again, another image of this sort of futility of what is going on here. They're just sort of shooting bullets in the air. And then he finally pulls the tin whistle. And it's not the bullets that disperse the natives, but it's this eerie whistle. Sort of this I love this. It's almost like an image, this high-pitched scream of the demon that inhabits the boiler of the tin steamer, right? And it's this otherworldly scream that disperses the natives. And so one of the white guys says to Marlowe, and by the way, I suppose Mr. Kurtz is dead as well by this time. This really strikes Marlowe. We have to ask, of course, why? Why does it really strike him? For the moment, that was the dominant thought. This is an indentation of a paragraph. The paragraph begins for the moment, if you're looking for it. It's on page 57, the bottom of page 57. For the moment, that was the dominant thought. There was a sense of extreme disappointment, as though I had found out I had been striving after something altogether without a substance. I didn't even know I wanted this, but I realized I really want to meet Kurtz. I couldn't have been more disgusted if I had traveled all this way for the sole purpose of talking with Mr. Kurtz. I flung one shoe overboard and became aware that that was exactly what I had been looking forward to, a talk with Kurtz. I made the strange discovery that I had never imagined him as doing, but as discoursing. So he never sees Kurtz doing something, but he sees Kurtz as holding forth, as discoursing. I didn't say to myself, now I will never see him, or now I will never shake him by the hand, but now I will never hear him. The man presented himself as a voice. Love that. Man presented himself as a voice, like a voice of the gods. Not, of course, that I did not connect with him, some sort of action. Hadn't I been told in all the tones of jealousy and admiration that he had collected, bartered, swindled, and stolen more ivory than all the other agents together? That was not the point. The point was in his being a gifted creature. And that all of his gifts, Mr. Kurtz, all of his gifts, the one that stood out preeminently, that carried with it a sense of real presence, was his ability to talk, his words, the gift of expression, the bewildering, the illuminating, the most exalted, and the most contemptible, the pulsating stream of light, or the deceitful flow from the heart of an impenetrable darkness. The other shoe went flying onto the devil god of that river. I thought, by Jove. Notice how many times he says, by Jove. Pay attention to that. I think that that's important too. By Jove, it's all over. We're too late. He has vanished. The gift has vanished. by means of some spear, arrow, or club. I will never hear that chap speak after all. And my sorrow had a startling extravagance of emotion. He struck Marlowe. Why am I so sad by this? I will never hear that chap speak after all, and my sorrow had a startling extravagance of emotion, even such as I had noticed in the howling sorrow of these savages in the bush. I couldn't have felt more lonely desolation. Somehow, had I been robbed of a belief or had missed my destiny in life. So now Kurtz has sort of taken the position of it's more important to meet and speak with Kurtz than belief or even discerning his destiny in life. Why do you sigh? Now he's talking directly to the people on board the Nellie. Why do you sigh in this beastly way? Somebody absurd? Well, absurd. Good Lord. Mustn't a man ever? Here, give me some tobacco. Now notice this little break. So this sort of, he's losing himself. Remember, if we're looking back at the three-part structure that we talked about earlier, we've got the commission and the journey. We haven't met Kurtz yet, but in the middle of his telling the story about Kurtz, he's overcome with that feeling of what it was like to find out that he might not hear his voice. And so it births this whole aside. So he gets himself worked up and he can sense in his audience that his audience is like, oh, come on, Marlowe, you're overdoing this. He says, give me some tobacco. There was a pause of profound stillness. Then a match flared and Marlowe's lean face appeared. Can't you see that image? They're in the dark. And they're just sort of hearing Marlowe, also a voice, telling a story. And he lights a match to pull on his pipe, and his face gets illumined. And instead of a smile, he's this lean face. He's being moved by the retelling of his own story. Worn, hollow, with downward folds and dropped eyelids, with an aspect of concentrated attention. And as he took vigorous draws at his pipe, it seemed to retreat and advance out of the night in the regular flicker of the tiny flame. The match went out. Absurd, he cried. This is the worst of trying to tell. Here you all are, each moored with two good addresses, like a hulk with two anchors, a butcher round one corner, a policeman round another, excellent appetites and temperature, normal, you hear normal, from year's end to year's end. You're a bunch of normies. You don't understand. It's frustrating. I'm trying to get you to see, and none of you fools can see. And you say absurd? Absurd be, exploded. Absurd. My dear boys, what can you expect from a man who out of sheer nervousness had just flung overboard a pair of new shoes? Now I think of it, it is amazing I did not shed tears. I am, upon the whole, proud of my fortitude. I was cut to the quick at the idea of having lost the inestimable privilege of listening to the gifted Kurtz. Of course I was wrong. The privilege was waiting for me. Oh yes, I heard more than enough. And I was right too. A voice. He was very little more than a voice. And I heard him, it, this voice, other voices. All of them were so little more than voices, and the memory of that time itself lingers around me, impalpable, like a dying vibration of one immense jabber, silly, atrocious, sordid, savage, or simply mean without any kind of sense. Voices, voices, even the girl herself. Now, he was silent for a long time. It's like, what is this? Other voices, it. Who's he talking to? Isn't he talking about Kurtz? But it's like Kurtz has these parts, different aspects, these different forces inside of him somehow. I laid the ghost of his gifts at last with a lie, he began suddenly. Girl? What? Did I mention a girl? And of course, all of us should at this point be like, no, you didn't mention a girl. What are you talking about here, Marlowe? Oh, she is out of it completely. They, the women, I mean, are out of it, should be out of it. We must help them to stay in that beautiful world of their own, lest ours gets worse. Oh, she had to be out of it. You should have heard the disinterested body of Mr. Kurtz saying, my intended. I want you to mark this passage because it'll make sense later on. It's one of these weird out-of-sequence passages. But what he's doing here is he's talking to Kurtz's girlfriend, fiancée, after the fact. So he lays to bed the death of a ghost with a lie. So he's speaking to Kurtz's girlfriend. Oh, she had to be put out. You shouldn't have heard it. My intended, you would have perceived directly by how completely she was out of it. And the lofty frail bone of Mr. Kurtz, they say hair goes on growing sometimes, but this specimen was impressively bald. The wilderness had patted him on the head, and behold, it was like a ball, an ivory ball. It had caressed him, and lo, he had withered. It had taken him, the wilderness. It had taken him, loved him, embraced him, got into his veins, consumed his flesh, and sealed his soul to its own by the inconceivable ceremonies of some devilish initiation. Again, you have to ask yourself the question, what exactly is going on here? What is Marlowe talking about? Inconceivable ceremonies of some devilish initiation. Oh, there was ivory, he goes on to say, loads of it, top of page 60. We filled the steamboat with it and had to pile a lot on the deck. Thus he could see and enjoy as long as he could see, because the appreciation of this favor had remained with him to the last. You should have heard him say, my ivory. Oh, yes, I heard him. My intended, my ivory. Excuse me. My station, my river, my everything belonged to him. It made me hold my breath in expectation of hearing the wilderness burst into a prodigious peal of laughter that would shake the fixed stars in their places. Everything belonged to him. But that was trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to. How many powers of darkness claimed him for their own. That was the reflection that made you creepy all over. It was impossible. It was not good for one either. Trying to imagine. He had taken a high seat among the devils of the land. I mean, literally, as the literally bomb. I mean, literally, you can't understand. How could you? You, with your solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or to fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman and the holy terror of scandal and gallows and lunatic asylums. You're all a bunch of normies. How can you imagine what particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him into by the way of solitude, utter solitude, without a policeman? By the way of silence, utter silence, where no warning voice or kind neighbor can be heard whispering of public opinion? These little things make all the great difference. When they are gone, you must fall back upon your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. Of course, you may be too much a fool to go wrong, too dull even to know you are being assaulted by the powers of darkness. I take it, no fool ever made a bargain for his soul with the devil. The fool is too much of a fool, or the devil too much a devil. I don't know which. It's a little slap Marlowe has at his audience and therefore at us. It's like, you normies just don't get it. You've got your police officers and guardians and all these people that kind of make sure that everything goes swimmingly. But when you're out there like Kurtz, like me, he doesn't even say like me. He basically says like Kurtz. He says, I'm not man enough for it. But Kurtz, like, he went there. Have you gone to the depths of what you are capable of doing? This is tough stuff. This is where he goes. He says, or you may be such a thunderingly exalted creature as to be altogether deaf and blind to anything but heavenly sights and sounds. Or you're just so good, you're just a sort of a living saint, and you're not prone to these kinds of temptations. You have no idea what you're capable of doing because you live in a carefully curated garden, not the wilderness. You just don't know. By Jove. Next page on 61. Mind, I'm not trying to excuse or even explain. I'm trying to account to myself for Mr. Kurtz, for the shade of Mr. Kurtz. This initiated wraith from the back of nowhere honored me with its amazing confidence before it vanished altogether. This was because it could speak English to me. The original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, and, as he was good enough to say himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English, his father was half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Mr. Kurtz. And by I learned that, most appropriately, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. And he had written it too. I've seen it. I've read it. It was eloquent. This is the report that Kurtz writes, that Marlowe has been entrusted to bring back. I read it. It was eloquent, vibrating with eloquence, but too high-strung, I think. 17 pages of close writing he had found time for, but this must have been before his, let us say, nerves went wrong and caused him to preside at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which, as far as I reluctantly gathered from what I had heard at various times, were offered up to him. Do you understand? To Mr. Kurtz himself. But it was a beautiful piece of writing. The opening paragraph, however, in the light of latter information, strikes me now as ominous. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity, and so on and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded, etc., etc. From that point, he soared and took me with him. He had me. I'm going with him. This is brilliant. The peroration was magnificent. They're difficult to remember. You know, it gave me the notion of an exotic immensity ruled by an august benevolence. It made me tingle with enthusiasm. This was the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning noble words. There were no practical hints to interrupt the magic current of phrases, unless a kind of note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as the exposition of a method. Peroration is a kind of circling dance upward. It was very simple, and at that end of moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment. It blazed at you, luminous and terrifying, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. So what do we do with that? This brilliant man writing this soaring piece of prose about appearing to these savages as if you were gods. Now, very clear here that Kurtz is not what we would conventionally call a believer. Not in any kind of Christian sense, let's say. But he's certainly a believer in something else. Remember, all of Europe conspired to make Mr. Kurtz. All of Europe. I don't know if you know anything about the firmament of ideas in the mid-19th century, heading into the latter 19th century, but this is where all the good stuff comes from, so to speak. This is where, this is sort of the high time of Enlightenment philosophy, Hegel and Marx and all the good guys, right? Feuerbach, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when you cut God out of the equation, someone has to fulfill that role. So Kurtz, enthusiastic Kurtz, principled Kurtz, goes in to enlighten the savages, so to speak, and yet goes in and instead of enlightening them, he becomes a demon god of the land, certain midnight rites, and got himself worshipped. Very curious. Very curious. Whatever he was, he will not be forgotten. He was not common. He was super. He was uber, so to speak. So they get to the station and they see in the distance a hut, right? And it's got all the posts, but the fence is gone now, right? So the sort of protected, sort of this walled complex, has been unwalled, right? But the posts are still there, right? So I want you to pay attention to those posts. And then they meet the guy, and he says to him, "You don't talk with that man; you listen to him." And this is the Russian, and the Russian has been is a character that will tell them that they don't want him to go. Now, when you're hearing this story for the first time, you really have no idea what Marlowe is really talking about, right? Because it's out of sequence, right? So we can ask the question, why does he give us this information right now? I don't know the answer to that, really. I mean, I could probably come up with something fancy if you give me a few minutes, but I won't bore you with that. But I want you to ask yourself that question. Why does Marlowe tell an asequential story? So he's got the A frame, like the main sort of sequence, but he's got these moments. He comes in and out of the story. And partly, of course, we know that Marlowe survives this ordeal because he's telling us the story about something that happened to him, right? So that's in part what's going there. But what is the power that occurs with that? All right, so we've been going, okay, all right, sorry, I get a little carried away here with some of the prose. It's just so beautiful, and it renders itself intelligible, right? So not only are you getting information from a data standpoint, right, but it is also informing us, right? It is forming our affective world, right? It is building out this sense feeling, this feeling sensation, this dreamscape, which is kind of like a nightmare scape, but it's building this out for us, to make us feel this, right? So he's gifting us with this creepy experience. And like, well, what for? Why is this? And I think part of his frustration as he's remembering Kurtz is he's predicting that we're going to want to draw certain sort of clear lines between us and Kurtz, right? People like Kurtz do that stuff, not me. I have principles. I have beliefs. I have restraint. And Marlowe is just like, no, you don't. Not really. You don't. Okay. So for next class, we're gonna see Kurtz, right? We're actually gonna meet him, and we're gonna see sort of what's going on with the deal. So I'm really looking forward to that part. I have left the chat. If anybody has a direct question, if you have any sort of practical question you want me to wrestle with, you can drop that in the chat, as they say. By the way, since you are already on YouTube and you're here, so I'm guessing that you probably already hit the bells and whistles, but if you would do that, that would be wonderful. If you could tell friends about this, somebody you might know that would be interested in learning. This is really geared toward, adults who miss this kind of thing. Not sure why we just think high school students and college students should do this. I think we should all do it, and it's a lot of fun, but I know it's hard to do in time. So I really do appreciate it and really grateful that you want to show up and do this kind of thing. So, all right, on that note, we're about an hour and 20 in, so I'm going to draw this one to a close. Again, thank you very much. Please send people on over to my Substack to subscribe. It's still for free, and they can get my updates and news information and some future things there. So thank you, everybody, and I will see you next time. Cheers. Godspeed.